Welcome to Designers on Designers, and today we're going to be discussing neuro-inclusive design. Let's set the scene a little bit. So as workplaces, hospitality settings, and public environments become more focused on well-being, the conversation around neuro-inclusive design is gaining real momentum. But what does designing for difference actually look like in practice? In this discussion, brought to you by Tarkett and Mix Interiors, we're going to be exploring how designers and manufacturers are rethinking space through the lens of neurodiversity. Joining me today, we have Universal Design Studios' Hurst, Ashlar ID's Debbie Watts, and Tarkett's Shaz Hawkins. We're going to dive in now to our first chapter, Understanding Neuro-Inclusivity. What are we really talking about here? So we're going to go down the line, and if you can just answer, what does neuro-inclusive design actually mean to you?
For me, I think that it is about considering the whole space, everything that's involved in it and all the different users that are potentially going to be in the space, not just kind of one person. I think we always try and forefront people and think about how they might feel in a space and try and kind of provide clarity, comfort and choice within the environments we create.
How do you understand neurodiversity as a term? I guess just to get a sense of what that actually means to each of you, because it can mean something different, I think, depending on the designer or the manufacturer.
I don't think it means one thing specific, like it's not that one person is the same as the next, but it can be kind of like people responding differently to different environments. Some kind of are too intense, people require kind of like quieter moments. So I think you just have to kind of build all of that in. You can't necessarily treat it as a one stop kind of solution.
So for me, it's about designing for every mind. Knowing that everyone experiences space and environments in a different way. And that's not necessarily just down to a neurodivergent or a neurotypical brain. It's about any kind of experience in that one day for that one human being. So I think it's very much a broad subject that we have to consider that human being on that day. But then obviously there's another layer. If you're neurodivergent, everything's turned up a little.
And so as with Ellen, neurodivergent, how do you understand that term?
I have an autistic ADHD son, and through his eyes, I have seen implicitly the challenges that an environment can create. And in terms of the actual label of neurodivergent, again, that is where you're wired slightly differently. I don't like the idea of a prescriptive, narrow distinction because it's so broad. And, you know, day to day, every human being can experience something slightly different. If you're menopausal, if you're not feeling well, then your sensory profile is a little bit different. But having a diagnosis obviously gives you that ability to understand your brain, but it's an ongoing challenge, and I think we're still learning. And I certainly am, as a parent of a neurodivergent son, and also experiencing some of the traits myself.
I think for me, it's designing flexibly. Like the others have already said, we're all different. Whether you have a label, and some people want one, or you don't, our brains work differently, behave differently, react differently. And we need a space that any human being can go into and find either peace, calm. Sometimes we just need a bit more energy, so go into a space where you can be a bit more active and do a bit more. So yeah, it's designing flexibly rather than fit for purpose, maybe. It has to be fit for purpose, don't get me wrong, but yeah, design flexibility.
So same question as the others. You mentioned that we're all different in our own ways. So what does neurodivergence or neurodiversity mean to you as a term?
It is just being different. I mean, if you look at it, what the term means, if you look at it in the dictionary, it is a difference in the brain. We're wired differently, we act differently, whether that be because you may have a neurodivergence, or we're just having a stressful day, or something's happened, like Debbie said, menopausal, stress, all of these things come into play. So for me, I understand that we need clinical terms, and I think it works very well in the medical profession. But I think if I'm looking at it from a design perspective, all I need to understand, and when I'm working with clients as well, or I try and get them to understand, is that we are different. Depending on the day, the week, the year, whatever's going on in our life, we just we behave differently. And that alters throughout our life as well. What we start being or come into the world behaving as and what we maybe leave the world behaving as, different.
So I want to talk about why this matters now, why this conversation is urgent today. So who does this really affect? And as I said, why is this conversation so timely?
So for me, I think that there is obviously increased awareness. I don't know whether there's increased acceptance as yet. There's still a lot of stigma out there, and I experience it myself through all sorts of different things I've experienced over the years. But it is a subject matter that people are becoming more aware. I think that there's also, if you are able to understand it and utilize the strengths in the neurodivergent brain, which are considerable, then there is a benefit to society. So I think that there's two sides. There's one, it's more awareness, but we need it to be more acceptance, and the term understanding, it just needs to be acknowledged. It's part of life. But also, if you are able to harness those strengths, then there's a benefit to society. And I think that people are beginning to clock onto that. And so I think that's another reason why it's being talked about more.
What do you think, Ellen? Why now? Why is this conversation urgent today?
I think it's for everyone, and I completely agree. I think that it is something that you just need to be aware of, accept, and then kind of embed into design rather than adding it on at the end as like this token kind of tick box, and we've done this and we've done that, or we didn't think about that, let's quickly do X, Y, and Z in the design. It's actually, we should just be aware of it from the beginning, make our clients aware, make everybody else aware, so that we're kind of all on the same page. And then it's not kind of a standout thing, it's just naturally embedded, and it doesn't single people out or make people feel, uncomfortable.
Shaz, people have arguably always been neurodiverse. That's not a new thing. And yet this conversation, as I said in the intro, feels like it's gained some momentum, more so in recent years than before. Why do you think that is? Why is this conversation feeling so timely now?
I think it's the awareness. I think people are more open to talk about themselves. I know when I talk to people, I will give personal experiences. I think that's the only way how you can maybe get some people on board, for them to actually feel that empathy and to maybe get some understanding. But it's no more important today than what it was yesterday or last year or 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when I probably worked on my first project that really needed an inclusive environment. I just think there's just a lot more awareness. And if we don't design inclusively now, I think we're not doing our due diligence. We're being ignorant to a fact that we can't just walk into any building now and think that it's just going to work, or design today like we did 10 years ago and think that will be fit for purpose. Things move up.
And it feels as though this is really part of a wider conversation around inclusivity. You mentioned the stigma attached to this idea of neurodivergence. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit? So what are some of those stigmas, and are those being eroded now, and is that to the benefit of everyone?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I think that there is this misunderstanding. There are kind of these little boxes that people like to put people in. And I think that what we need to try and do is help people understand that that's not particularly useful. I think that the stigma is really interesting. I did some research with a college, and the students were basically saying that they're not sure about disclosing whether they're neurodivergent. And I think that goes across the board in the workplace. I think that there are new processes with DE&I and going through HR where people do ask if you are. But I think that there's a great big pause for people to actually tick that box to say that they are, because they genuinely don't know whether they're going to be looked after, or recognised that there are reasonable adjustments that can be made. However, that's not necessarily always the case. So I think that there is a very delicate balance at the moment where, yes, there's increased awareness, but there's also quite a lot of negative noise out there in certain areas of the media. There's lots of judgment, and that weighs heavy on some people. So there are people that are happily talk, I think neurodivergent people find neurodivergent people, and we will talk and we will be empathetic and we will understand each other. But then if you go outside the box and start talking in certain circles, then you can maybe feel a bit uncomfortable and retreat back. And I think that happens a lot. And I certainly experience it with some of the stuff that my son does, that he's labelled, and therefore sometimes people steer away because of his diagnosis.
And some of that, it feels like it comes maybe from a place of ignorance. Ellen, in a bit later in the conversation, we'll talk about some of the actual work that you've done in terms of bringing neuro-inclusivity into the design. But on a more superficial level, what do you think are some of the misconceptions about neurodiversity and actually how that intersects with the design of spaces?
I think that if some people think that you have to make the design less bold, less creative, because you're kind of catering to kind of different needs. But I think that's not at all the case. I think you can still be really, bring in loads of interesting materials, interesting textures, layers, lighting, acoustics that suit different kind of spaces for different functions. I think as long as you make people aware, allow transitions into bolder spaces, allow moments of pause, choice maybe before entering or after, and clearly kind of define that, then you can make the design, as interesting and bold as perhaps before. But I think that sometimes people are scared if you kind of go down this research route that then you're going to have to pare everything back. Which is not the case. And we've done projects where we've definitely kind of thought about neuro-inclusive design, but also kept the concept strong.
Shaz, Tarkett is really a leader in research in this area. And of course, you have consumed a huge amount of information when it comes to neuro-inclusive design. Sticking with this idea of misconceptions, now that you have got to grips with this topic in such depth, was there anything that challenged maybe some of your preconceptions?
Not necessarily. I went into this maybe quite naively. So even though I'm with Tarkett now, my first project, and it was from a design perspective, was nearly 15 years ago. And I went in and I felt so much pressure to deliver this project. It was one of the first SEND schools that Salisbury Council were doing. And I didn't know where to start. And there was that fear of disappointing, the fear of getting it wrong, which you get. And so I just said to the local authority, I need to meet with the kids. I need to meet with the kids. I need to get the teachers in. I want their parents in. And I need to talk to them and see what we can do. But in saying that, I've definitely come across people that have got misconceptions, and like you say, they think they need to dull down, or you can't do this, you can't do that, or you have to do this. I think that's the worst one. We feel like there's this tick box that you get a list of things, you do all of those, and you've got a perfect design. That's not the case because we're so different. But I think although there are misconceptions, maybe I'm being a bit hopeful here. I'd like to think that more people are now on board and really wanting to try and do it for the right reasons, as opposed to
ticking a box.
Yeah.
Well, I guess going back 15 years, there must have been a lot less awareness around this topic, certainly a lot less research in terms of practical application. So how was it back then compared to now? Is the benefit of all of that extra research and awareness something that really aids in creating more inclusive spaces?
I think some things have to be taken maybe with a pinch of salt. And sometimes you can maybe, if there's too much, there's not legislation, there's guidance, but if there was too much, people might feel a bit stifled. But actually it's really helpful, because I think what it's shown over the course of all the research, and actually building buildings or designing buildings that are either great and work really well, or learning from the ones that haven't worked well, has just maybe allowed us to explore certain things and actually talk about it a lot more and more, just openly, than what we've probably done in the past. So it's definitely benefited.
Well, you mentioned you have hope. So let's stay with that. Where are we seeing some promising early shifts? Are there any standout examples or sectors where you feel like, they're really getting to grips with this and doing it well? What do you think, Ellen?
I think a positive shift for me is that actually some of the clients that we've got are bringing this to the table. It's not us having to kind of introduce them to kind of consultants or work we've done in the past. They've already kind of had a report done, got some insights. It's not that they necessarily know how to include that in the work, but it's kind of at the forefront of their minds, and then they kind of bring it to us. I think it's actually quite challenging as a designer to then have to kind of think about the whole space, the concept, what it's going to visually look like, how it's going to function, and then there's all these extra layers that we're kind of weaving in. But it is very helpful that clients are kind of pushing that at the beginning, and we're not having to kind of labour over that and try and get that across. It is something that they're thinking about.
There is a definite appetite to engage with that kind of neuro-inclusive, more sensory approach. I think that that's the other thing that I noticed a lot at Clerkenwell, that there was a lot more talk about sensory design as well as inclusive design, and they go hand in hand, because obviously if you're neurodivergent, your sensory profile is slightly different and slightly more sensitive. I think that the biggest thing that we have, that I've experienced, is the fear of people getting it wrong. And I think, like, you were saying early on, there is that genuine fear. And so sometimes there's just inactivity because they'd rather play safe and not get it wrong and just go with the norm and the old standards. But no, in terms of that, hopefully there's a lot more talk about it. The fact that it's being talked about as much as it is, that's got to be a good thing.
This is a subject that designers are really getting to grips with. And you mentioned that in terms of some of the research or the information that's out there, we might want to take some of it with a pinch of salt. What should we take with a pinch of salt? What advice can you offer in that sense?
It's taking a step back. So all of the guidance that we have, whether it be about lighting, acoustics, glare, texture, we need to be aware of it, but actually there isn't that right or wrong, because there are so many differences within how we interact with what we're touching, feeling, sensing. I think what we need to just be mindful of is providing a choice. And I think you said choice earlier. So it's not going in and saying everything has got to be this or it can't be that, but actually just giving a bit of a mix. So
that's what people should take with a pinch of salt, I guess, is anything that feels like a binary. Like this is right and this is wrong.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we'll move into our second chapter then, designing for difference, tensions, tools, and trade-offs. So what are some tangible design elements, whether that's lighting, acoustics, layout, materials, that help or maybe harm neurodivergent users?
I guess I could talk about the Jellicoe, which is a project that we completed at King's Cross with Fora. We have quite a lot of bold colours and different materials in this project, but kind of neurodiversity was one thing that the client was pushing, and we worked with Motion Spot and lecturer Joan Love on the kind of subject. And when it comes to choice, I guess we have different elements. So we've got quite an intense red space, which is individual working. It's quite dark, the lighting is much softer, and then there's some individual kind of focus booths off the side. And then on the contrary, we've got a wellness suite on the second floor, which is within like a timber-lined box, and the walls in there are made from pressed lavender, so it's actually like a scent that you kind of sense on the way in. And I think that kind of the mix of different materials worked really well there. And again, just kind of adapting lighting and acoustics depending on how you want people to feel within those spaces.
So there's a lot of diversity of elements there, something bolder, something more calm, something that smells great. How do those actually help?
I think for the wellness suite, for example, we really wanted to give people an opportunity to kind of get away from their desks, to feel calm, to experience something different without having to necessarily leave their office building. And it really is a space where you take your shoes off as you go in, and it doesn't really feel like you're in a workplace. So I think that helps in terms of kind of providing that choice. And then I guess we've also got kind of larger communal tables, which allow people to kind of work collaboratively in a more like buzzy environment. And then round the corner from that, you've kind of got individual work booths where someone can take themselves off to be by themselves or focus. So I think that's really where we provide the choice. And
so it's a lot about flexibility of environment.
Yeah, and even on the kind of main office floors, you've got a busy central hub where people are grabbing coffee, getting their lunch, but just around the corner from those, again, there's some small kind of banquet seating moments where you can just take a moment before you go off to your office. So I think that was like a really key thing to look at. And I think we should always, as designers, interrogate a plan, think about how the users are moving through the building, what have they experienced before they get to the next moment. And I think just that consideration and that thinking helps you to kind of like work it in to the design.
Let's stay with that project, because you made choices of what to include, but presumably you also made choices as to what to exclude. So these are things that help neurodivergent users. What actually causes harm? What did you decide not to include?
I guess across the project, there's very little kind of synthetic materials. We use linoleum throughout the project as a natural kind of flooring, lots of timbers, again, for sustainability reasons, but also kind of this calming nature. throughout the kind of project, there's a lot of different colours, but everything feels quite soft in terms of its tone and tactility. So I think kind of consistent details in certain respects can allow you to kind of then dial up kind of the colours and different elements in other ways. I don't know if that actually answered the question.
No, I think so. Debbie, because we touched earlier on this idea that neuro-inclusive design doesn't have to be bland. So let's go back to this notion of tangible design elements that help or harm. Let's start with the help.
So yeah, I think exactly as Ellen said, there's certain things that are given. You know, we've got to really think about acoustics. We've really got to think about positioning and wayfinding, that kind of certainty, so that, you know, even down to the point of creating a sensory map so that we know that the areas that are going to be overstimulating or understimulating. Also, things like little bits, little touches, like saying you find your calm here, but if you need to stim, which is something else that's a neurodivergent brain, to actually have a space where you can go off and do that without being judged, which is also another thing. So yeah, I think in terms of the givens, you know, definitely acoustics. Lighting is huge. There is some really interesting research going on at the moment about LED lighting and the fact that it's got the blue cool hues, not very good for any of us, let alone the neurodivergent brain. So the warmer lights are much better. So again, there's all sorts of research that's coming out. There's a chap called Xander Kadic who has done some fascinating information about the challenges and the damage that some of our lighting is doing to us as human beings. We spend 90% of our time indoors. So it's like, this lighting shouldn't necessarily be creating challenges for our physiology and our brains. So that's a big one, the lighting as a whole, and also having localized control so that not everybody wants it on a certain level of light, and equally some people might choose a colored light. So the more choice you can give, again, we're going to talk about choice a lot through this, because having that localized control and choice for that individual is huge. I think the other thing in terms of hindrances is, you know, wayfinding and positioning. If that person is sat, someone that can get overstimulated by certain things, if you're sat in a certain place where people are walking behind you all the time, that's something that comes up again and again. They need to have that visibility of what's going on around them. If someone's walking behind them all the time, that's a real trigger. Equally, if you're next to a very noisy space or a space like a tea point that's got lots of different aromas coming outside of it, or eating at your desk, this is where the cultural layer comes in, where people are able to know what they can and can't do in a space. So all of these things is like a recipe that can continue in terms of the pros and the cons.
Do you think people misunderstand this as being something that's about aesthetics, whereas actually a lot of what you've touched upon there is really about reducing friction, sources of anxiety?
Absolutely. We can create great spaces, but without protocols and etiquette, then those spaces don't actually perform as we'd like them to perform. So it's really important to embed that in.
Shaz, tangible design elements that can help or harm. Again, let's start with the help.
I think the help is what we've all just spoken about. It's flexibility. It's thinking about the actual products that you're going to put in that space. You spoke about natural products. It's so important. Like Debbie said, we're in a building 90% of the time. VOCs, harmful ingredients, they are detrimental to human health. So we've got to think about what we're putting in there. One of the things that's not kind of relevant to your question, but it's just made me think of it when we've all been talking. I think you can create the perfect building, well, perfect, pinch of salt, a really well-designed building that would be good for a lot of people. But what people tend to forget, it's actually the most stress that you can get could be actually getting to the building. So even though you come through the door, it's a wonderful environment, it offers that choice, that clarity, the calm, or stimulation if you need it. If you've really struggled to get there, then you're already on, as that person entering the building, you're already on a back foot, and you're possibly not going to see it for what it actually is. And I think a lot of times, and this isn't the designer at fault here, or an architect, or whoever it might be, it could actually be the people that own the building. Are they actually communicating to the individuals that they want to draw to that building and saying, do you know what, if you need to get here, if you don't drive, you can take public transport, or you can walk, or you can ride a bike, this is where you need to park. this is the entrance or the exit. These, like you said, that sensory map, this is the quieter area, this is the busy area. And I think if you can take people on that journey and just allow them to feel in control and understand where they're going, the building then and the design that's been put in can be better received and just enjoyed a lot more. So yeah, I think that's just...
And yet we all maybe want slightly different things. It was not long ago, actually, during Clerkenwell Design Week, I was talking to a designer who was saying she loves to go into the office because it's really loud and there's always loads of stuff happening and people tapping her on the shoulder and discussions. And I thought, oh, that sounds like my idea of hell when I've got to get on with something focused, which kind of throws up this question of how we balance competing sensory needs. So what gives when not everyone wants the same thing?
I think that it's really difficult to strike that balance, especially if it's a smaller building, because you can't offer necessarily all of those different zones or the elements of choice within design. So it's very much, again, I talk about positioning, and I think that thoughtful initial planning and as you say, right from the start when you're starting to create a space, just thinking of that user journey and obviously engaging with the users prior to starting to think about what that's going to look like. Because the people that are using it, yes, okay, they may well be a churn of those people, but if we can get a sort of a benchmark of how people like to use the space that are actually occupying it, that's a good start. But trying to avoid that conflict, it's obviously just trying to avoid noise and calm being too close together, scent and kind of that sort of need to not experience that. It's just trying to, again, it's almost like a formula that you can follow to a certain point, and then it's that human layer that you need to bring in afterwards.
Just as an extension of that, kind of put you on the spot a little bit, we talk about this idea of creating spaces that can include lots of people, but can one size fit all? Is it ever really possible to create an environment that actually works for everyone?
It is possible to create pockets that can tick boxes, although I don't like to use that phrase, but can actually resolve the challenges that people face. So there's some key things that you need to make sure that they're embedded. There's other bits that are really nice to have, but either budget or space or whatever, there's going to be restrictions on that. But as long as you've got a space where you can have calm, like you say, the journey into the office can be very stressful. That moment that you get in before you get into the bit that you work in, if you create that space of calm, it's really important. But we also know that calm isn't right for everybody, and they'll want something that's more energetic. So it's almost those two extremes, if you can have that as a base mark. And then obviously it's ensuring that there's, like you say, these punctured spaces throughout a zone of space that you can at least step away from one style into another. So again, it goes back to the choice, just making sure that, and also enabling those people to use those spaces, not specifically at, oh, okay, it's coffee time, you can go and have a moment. It's actually allowing those people, when they're into that point of overwhelm or just needing to get away from that space, that they can.
Ellen, you're inevitably working with a client and a brief. So before we get into some specifics, can a space be all things to all people? Is that ever truly possible?
That is very tricky. I'm not sure that can, but I think you can, as we've said, kind of break off and kind of understand what spaces need to do what. I always think that at the start of a project, you really need to kind of delve into what's the client's aspirations, who are the users and what do they want from the space. And it's about kind of designing to support those functions that we really want to encourage. So you don't ever know like how someone's necessarily going to use a table, whether they're going to eat there, whether they're going to collaborate there, whether they're going to work there. But I think just kind of maybe grouping things together, maybe larger tables in more communal settings, and then kind of making more individual moments in different areas. But I do think it's really important to understand who is going to be using the space, what activities do you want to encourage there. I think for me, going into the office is also that point that you made about having a social kind of time, speaking, collaborating with my colleagues is like, the joy that it brings me is great. When I work from home, I don't get that. It's not the same on a are cool. So I actually really encourage it to be a little bit busier, a bit livelier, to have that kind of spontaneous conversation. But I know it doesn't work for everyone. We do in our office have kind of little pockets in the library, a little hidden space around the back of our materials library as well. So I think those moments are there. But I do think, like, yeah, understanding what it is you want people to do in the spaces, if you want them to collaborate, if you want them to talk, you can support that.
There's a kind of underlying conceit in some of the answers as we go through, which is that you have the space to deliver a variety of spaces, to offer that flexibility. But we also know that in an age of decreasing floor plates, hybrid working, that isn't always going to be possible either. So if you don't have expanses of floor space, lots of rooms to work with, how can we actually take some of these principles and make them work maybe on a smaller scale?
I think you can do some simple things. Like if you are stuck with a small space, you could incorporate a bright colour like you said, but maybe just have it on one wall and then give the flexibility with the desk if we're talking office environment here or even a school environment. We used to do it in schools all the time. So if somebody needs that stimulation, they want to see the brighter colour, they can be facing that colour. But if you don't, you turn your back on it. You can do the same thing with glare through the windows. It can be a real trigger for certain people. And I can remember hearing a story about, it was one of the first autistic schools in Scotland. And there was a young girl that went up a year group, obviously different classroom, and suddenly started really just struggling to be in that environment. And it turned out that it was a simple thing, well, we say simple thing, it went undiagnosed for a little, undiagnosed, but technical term there, but for a little while. But simply, the new room that she'd gone into, the teacher was sitting in front, the light was behind, and that glare of the light coming through and then the teacher was just too much for her. So all they needed to do was move the table around, just turn that around so slightly, and everything was much better for her.
But I love that we're talking about schools, because not even by design, but the conversation is kind of segged into offices, because it feels like maybe the conversation is more progressed there. Offices are highly engineered, highly designed, but there are all these other types of spaces like schools, hospitals, where actually designing for neuro-inclusivity would have a demonstrable impact on users. So at what point are we going to be able to take this conversation and extend it out into some of those other sectors?
I genuinely think that it's already happening.
I was going to say
that,
exactly the same thing. Yeah.
I think that it is. There are. I mean, obviously, it's not across the board, but I do believe that it's already being talked about. I think that obviously the challenges are most of these things have to be retrofitted because most of these spaces are already in place. I think that there are a few products on the market that are on, mobile, and they have acoustic performance, and they can create those little respite moments, which are really, really important. I talk around with the schools. Obviously, that was my first sort of real experience of creating what I would see as a sort of sensory space where you could come in and for the students, and that was purely because of personal experience. And the children were creating the brief, and they were the ones that were able to articulate what they needed, which goes back to the user is got to drive what we do, as well as obviously our professional and lived experience. But I believe that if schools get it right, then we're not sort of bringing out a generation of people that are neurodivergent, that have not coped in education, that are coming out traumatized, potentially in some instances, from being in an environment that just doesn't suit. So if we then got that correct, then some of the things that we're talking about and trying to make some of these adjustments that we need might not be quite so necessary, because people will have a better ability to kind of come into a space. And I genuinely believe that that's something that needs to be really addressed within the school system.
I was just going to say, I think it did start. I think it actually did start in education and healthcare, because I know this sounds awful, had to. It just wasn't working, and there were people actually saying, this isn't working, what do we do? And it might have just been to create a sensory room, and I think that was the first steps that we actually saw. But I do believe it started there, and I think actually what's happened when you look at workplace now, hospitality, even like stores and shops, there's quiet times, aren't there, now in supermarkets? So I think it's moved quicker in that area, possibly where, like you say, more money available. I know that sounds awful, but there is. Not necessarily working with the older buildings, we're building new buildings and thinking about it. So it's just, accelerated and moved.
I mean, the money point is an interesting one, because it sounds like we kind of know what needs to be done. We've talked about flexibility, about color, lighting, acoustics, materials. It feels like all of the pieces of the puzzle are increasingly understood. In which case, if it was that easy, wouldn't every space just be a perfectly neuro-inclusive environment? And yet we know that that isn't the reality. I did jury duty not long ago, and I have to say that it was a miserable room in which to spend 2 weeks of my life. So where are these friction points coming from? Is it budget? Is it policy? Is it cultural resistance? We talked about stigma earlier. Why are we not getting it right and making those correct choices that you talked about earlier, Debbie? What do you think, Ellen?
I think sometimes there's multiple stakeholders involved in projects. So when you kick off a project and you kind of have this alignment and the aspirations are super high, and we create something very beautiful and it's doing all the things that we're hoping that the space would do, and we're working into that. And then I think that different people around the table have kind of different priorities. Some might be marketing led, some might be commercials, some might be visual. And I think that trying to keep everybody aligned and everybody on the same kind of track and thinking about the design and the ambition for the project in the same way can sometimes be quite challenging. This is like a personal thing, but responding to that thing, I have a friend who's a therapist, and she's trying to give people tools to help their everyday lives. And she says that she sits in a room with like a bright beaming light above them. And she's like, I'm trying to help them understand how to kind of calm themselves down, work through things. And then the room that we're in is horrible. And I think actually she didn't really realize that I could talk to that as well. I think in her mind, the design world and the world that she works in are very, very different. But actually I was like, explaining that is something that we consider on a daily basis as part of our world, which she found super interesting, which was great to kind of just understand a little bit more.
I'm going to ask you a blunt question then. It sometimes feels that when it comes to the design of spaces, people of course prioritize function and they want it to look great, but this notion of neuro-inclusivity can maybe feel a bit abstract, particularly perhaps to clients. Is it something that gets value engineered out?
I think as long as we design it to still be beautiful, still be crafted and still be thoughtful, we don't necessarily need to flag it as something that we've kind of done so that people don't think we're changing the design or changing that aspiration. It's just something that is inherent to the design from the beginning. But as we said before, it doesn't mean it has to be less bold. It doesn't mean it has to be less creative. I think we can still make it really, really beautiful. And that's what we strive to do. I'm trying to do that on a daily basis, still make sure that everything looks great. But that is just another layer that should just be weaved in naturally, not kind of shouted about.
Which leads us to our third chapter, talking about responsibility, product, space, system. Whose job is it anyway? So is neuro-inclusive design primarily a spatial challenge, a product problem, or a design culture issue? What do you think, Shaz?
It's all of them. It has to be all. I think from a manufacturer's point of view, we have to take ownership for what we're making, what we're putting out in the world, how people interact with that product, the longevity of that product, being able to take it back in-house. Sustainability becomes part of that if we're thinking human conscious design and designing for people and planet. So that is very important, and that's what we look at. But unless you're then designing something that when we're working with designers and clients actually want, if they don't want it, it's not going to do any good, is it? So I think it's everybody's responsibility to look at what we're doing and how we do it and all add to it and have an open conversation about what is needed, what is working, what may not be working, and yeah, just be open and discuss it together.
You mentioned sustainability, and it's an interesting analogy maybe because it wasn't such a talking point 10 years ago as it is today. And arguably it was designers that kind of forced the agenda, but of course they also needed client buy-in sometimes. They needed to get them on board and have them drive the conversation forward as well. And then of course manufacturers took note because they needed to produce products that designers wanted to specify. So taking what we've seen happen with sustainability and applying that to neuro-inclusive design, will we see a similar ownership of responsibility from designers, do you think? Where does the responsibility lie?
There's certain areas that people are naturally feeling more responsible because of personal interest, lived experience. There is also, in terms of legislation and kind of sort of responsibility, as designers and sort of part of businesses, we all have a responsibility to create great spaces that people want to be in. And under that umbrella, that naturally falls in. In terms of it being kind of a part of the systems that people want to apply regulation to, that's something else. I think it's still about, at the moment for me, trying to help people understand that if you create spaces that works for everybody, that it will ultimately benefit the business. So there's that bit that needs to kind of be filtered through and people understand. And then I think ultimately that won't necessarily have to be a sustainability exercise. It will be, this is good for people, rather than a line that have we done that bit.
So let's take this back to something practical. How do manufacturers actually work with designers and researchers to ensure a neuro-inclusive outcome? How do you do that with Tarkett?
Multiple things. Roundtables, we get together, have open discussions. When we're launching products, we're in a product development stage. I mean, that normally happens 2 years before we go to launch. We will go out, we will take the product to various different sites to test it, trial it, talk to designers, talk to end users, try and get their feedback, because as much as we have some understanding, none of us know everything, and you're only going to trial these things by actually seeing if they do work.
Who has to be the experts then? Because it's interesting you're saying that none of us fully understand these things, and there's a lot of pieces of a puzzle that go together to create a space. But more often than not, designers themselves are not experts in neuro-inclusivity. Product manufacturers are not necessarily experts. So who has to lead the way in becoming the expert so that there is a source of some informed knowledge at some part of the food chain?
I think it happens when you've got an interest. So for me, it was that first project where I had to go in, needed to deliver a certain brief, and then seeing the outcome, the result, and the children using the space was just, that's what set me off. That was, I want to do more of this. And then I just continued doing research, continued trying to understand and network and talk to the right people. And I think that's what happens. You've probably got 3 people here that really enjoy what they do and are passionate about what they do. And that's what drives it along. And then along the way, you meet more like-minded people, or somebody else does something. And we're human beings. I think we've got to be brutally honest that most people do things for self-gain, don't they? And it's that little bit of buzz when you know you've made a difference. For me, it was making a difference for somebody that then pushed me to do more. And I think that's how we sometimes all come together and keep the momentum going, really.
Have you had to become an expert in this? And if not, where do you look to for that expertise to inform your decision making?
I think there's a couple of routes. One is obviously collaborators, manufacturers, and asking the right questions. So looking at something, does it fit the purpose? Is it kind of suitable? Has it been used before? What's the feedback? All of those questions that you shouldn't just specify something, you should really make sure you dig into that, is one thing. And I think continually looking at different typologies. So say you're looking at a workplace, actually looking at hospitality projects, looking at wellness projects, and taking all the information from those, what's worked well, what are people really benefiting from, and then weaving that into your project is kind of really important as well. I think you're right, you have to kind of make that happen yourself. You have to ask the questions, you have to be interested, and you have to keep challenging yourself. I think you can't just kind of do something, go home, be be done with it. You have to keep asking questions. And we do this in the studio as well. Kind of you bring in other people from different projects, show them what you're doing, and then they can sometimes just bring in nuggets of information from what they've learned. And I think keeping conversations really open, being receptive to feedback and change will just, help.
So asking questions, Debbie, a two-part question. First of all, do we need to be less afraid of not looking like the experts? So kind of saying, well, actually, we don't know it all. And this is the benefit of collaboration. And then what does successful collaboration actually look like then between designers, manufacturers, and of course the end users?
Okay, so I mean, I think collaboration and knowledge share is really, really important. We should always be learning. We should always be asking the question, because there'll always be someone that's had a really positive or negative experience that can share that with you, and we can learn from that. And I think that's really, really important.
So what does successful collaboration look like then between user, manufacturer, designer?
So in terms of the final result being a sort of success, is obviously seeing people engaged in an environment that you've created, getting feedback saying that they're happier in the office, getting the sort of leaders saying, my goodness me, my staff all of a sudden feel happier. You know, there's less absenteeism, there's less presenteeism, and all that kind of thing. So there's all of those sort of HR-y type things. But ultimately, if people are happier at work, then they will thrive, and ultimately businesses will gain. So to me, that's the big picture. You know, for me personally, it's seeing feedback saying, I love the space that you created, but there's a much bigger ripple effect that can have such positive impact to a business.
And it's fine for designers, for example, to say, actually, we don't know it all, and we will have to look elsewhere for some support and expertise so that we can get to grips with this.
I think it's really important. I don't think anyone should assume that they know everything about everything. And with this particular subject, in designing with different sort of mindsets and minds, that you'll always find something new. I've always met somebody gone, I didn't really think about that, but oh my goodness, I should have thought about that. And I think that that's, again, you have to learn from things that you don't get quite right, and equally really share and sort of celebrate the things that really do work.
Well, on the subject of what works, we're going to move into our final chapter, the future we're building. What's next and what needs to change? So what's a near future change in practice that you think could become mainstream within a few years? What do you think, Ellen?
I honestly think it's the client awareness for me, that I think as long as everybody is on board and everyone kind of moves in that direction, it will be, again, back to the sustainability thing. That's just kind of getting embedded in everyone's work now. We wouldn't specify a material if it's not good for the person or good for the environment. You try and avoid that naturally. And I think it will be the same for this. It will just be part of what we do, part of our considerations. And I think as long as clients continue to get on board with that, it'll be positive.
I think it is going to just support what you just said, actually. I think it's everybody not just doing it for, I'm going to say the words, a tick box. I think it's everyone actually, realising it's important, coming together, and it being end users, the people within the space that are going to be using it and occupying it, the architect, designer, the manufacturers, actually all playing their part and doing it because it's the right thing to do rather than a commercial gain.
So that's a mindset shift, arguably, certainly with clients. So Debbie, to put you on the spot, what's one policy, law, or mindset shift that you think would accelerate neuro-inclusive design?
I think we've got things like the Equality Act, we've got things like reasonable adjustments, we've got lots of guidance. There's no legislation per se. I don't know whether that's something that should happen and how that looks, but I think that there may well be a need for that. Obviously, with the Part M and accessibility, that's what had to happen. So there's a question as to whether that will happen or not. But I think that the bigger thing, I always get asked, the commercial gain. I know there's the nice fluffy feeling of we're helping humans, but I think sadly there are many companies that like the concept of the fluffy bit but don't necessarily understand it, and there has to be a commercial gain. So I think that there needs to be much more evidence about the benefits of creating these more human-centric environments, and then that naturally might just follow through with people embracing that from that way, rather than, and I hate to be that, to say that that's how it could be potentially be driven, but I think it may well be, because I've had experiences where people sort of drop that bit, drop the biophilia, because it's something that it's not tangible. They can't see the benefits without.
And it maybe felt like a trend of some description, a talking point that had a moment and then kind of faded into oblivion. So I'm going to go down the line and actually ask you all this question, which is, how do we ensure that neuro-inclusivity doesn't become a trend, something for now to be forgotten about, and actually becomes a permanent part of how we design in the way that sustainability has become? Ella?
I think realising that it's more than accessibility and compliance, and it is actually about the way that people feel and the way people respond to spaces. And I think that then just becomes something that we all do naturally, we all think about all the time, and then it's not a trend, it's just part of the design process.
Do you think that has to be measured in some way? Is this actually about showing that if you design in a neuro-inclusive way, you get better results, people enjoy these spaces more, they function better?
Continually gathering feedback and kind of looking at the way people are interacting in spaces is just something that we should continue to do, and then use those learnings on future projects.
So I think that the interesting thing was, because as society there's so much more technology sort of infiltrating us as humans, I think naturally we will be wanting to connect back to sort of human behaviour from very, very long time ago. So working in sort of square buildings and being in a sort of space where it jars our bodies. And I think people are getting more and more aware of that kind of sensory approach. And that's obviously then, as I said before, naturally links in with neurodiversity and sort of inclusive design. So my thought is it's just not a trend, because we're humans. And so it's actually part of who we are and what we should be doing as human beings. So it's almost just realising and re-understanding that that's what we need to actually do our best.
Inclusive design is just as important as the air we breathe, the food, the water that we consume, being warm. It's a given. And I think because it's so, every single person can relate. Every single person has had a happy moment in their life, a sad moment in their life, a stressful time in their life, where you don't see the world the same as you may have seen it the day before. And I think because we all can relate, you can understand why neuro-inclusion and inclusion is just so vital, and that having that flexibility within a space is just important. And even when I hear the word, we had this conversation earlier, even when I hear the word trend put with that, I boil inside. Like it infuriates me, because it's just so much more. It's so much more.
Well, on that note, as for so much more, if you had one sentence or idea that would radically change the way we think about or apply neuro-inclusive design, what would it be?
It would be that we're never going to get it perfect. It is not a tick box exercise. There is no right or wrong. And actually, it's just by talking to each other, trying these things, learning as we go, that's one thing I would like to see. Yeah.
Debbie, one radical idea, a sentence that would change how we think about neuro-inclusive design?
I think if you're neurotypical, think about one day when you've gone into a space and felt really uncomfortable. That then will help you understand the challenges.
One kind of size or one solution isn't going to fit every brief, so always kind of just working through them and still trying to create spaces that are crafted, thoughtful, that can genuinely then support people that are in them.
Well, it's been a really fascinating conversation, as I hope you would agree, and certainly I'm leaving with some new lessons on neuro-inclusive design. So all that remains is to say a huge thank you to Tarkett for facilitating the conversation, and thank you to each of you for joining us.